mention, we're actually finally finishing our series on spiritual formation. You probably don't even know we've been doing it for an entire year, but it is coming to an end. And you know, it's apropos that we're ending with spiritual formation through work. Most of us here, if you're a New Yorker, you spend more time, more of your waking hours at work than anything else. I've been with the same business partner for over 20 years, and I spend way more time with him than I do with my wife, or my family, or anyone else. So our spirituality, if it doesn't inform us in the time that we're spending most of our time, in the activity that we're spending most of our time, then something's really wrong and defunct with our spirituality. And I think that's actually been an ill of the faith community as long as I've been involved in it. And tonight we're going to be very explicit about how to break this down. And so a brief outline of where I'm going with this. I'm going to start by talking about the sacred-secular divide. And this is what I was alluding to earlier. It's this sort of concept in the faith community, maybe even the world at large, that there are certain things that are sacred, that are infused with God. Things like our prayer life, things like praying for people. And then there's secular things, like our jobs, more mundane things. And this divide, I think, is a cancer. I think it's very detrimental to how we think about life with God and the way of Jesus. But I want to address that first. And then I'm going to give a brief biblical exposition on work. It's going to be very brief. It's going to center around the creation story, because I think the creation story gives a very good indication of how God thinks about work and the kind of culture he wants to create as we think about work. And then finally, I'm going to end with two very simple practical applications for how we can partner with God in the workplace. So, as a starter though, I'm going to give a brief window into my marriage with Kara. We have this recurring argument for the last 17 years, okay? It gets brutal at times. What movie do we go see?
Just Rocky all the time, right?
No, so this is the thing. This is not a battle of the sexes kind of thing. I apologize for that screen acting up. If you want to focus on that one, because that thing flashes from time to time and we haven't figured it out yet. But so what movie do we go see? Been arguing about this for the last 20 years. You know why? Kara likes movies with heroes in them. She likes things like the Avengers, Spider-Man, Thor, the whole Marvel DC Comics thing. I have no bid for these things, because these things are, for the most part, they're logically inconsistent. And if you know anything about me, you know that I'm into realism. I'm about things like The Wire, $1 Million Baby, super depressing film, American Beauty, things like that. So, we've compromised. Basically, she goes watches these movies with her friends, with all of you guys and everyone else, and I don't. So despite the fact that I really don't enjoy these movies, I actually do understand why they're so important. Heroes are really important. They play such a critical role in every culture, in every society. In some sense, they just give us something to aspire to, right? We don't live on principles. We don't live on just ideas. We need to see these ideals embodied in actual people. And especially as a parent, there's only so much I can convey to my son. But if I tell him, go be like Lionel Messi, there's like an embodiment right there. So parents, teachers, coaches, we need heroes. We celebrate our heroes because they really embody our most treasured values, right? So it begs the question, who are our heroes? Who are the heroes in the modern church? Okay. I thought about this, and here are the first several people that came to mind. The first is a missionary. Raise your hand if you know who Elisabeth Elliot is. Oh, okay. For the other half of the room that doesn't know, Elisabeth Elliot was a missionary to an indigenous tribe in Ecuador about 50, 60 years ago. This was a tribe that was, at the time, I believe, still a hunter-gatherer society. What's interesting is she ministered and converted people who had just several years prior had killed her husband. And so Elizabeth Elliot is rightfully lauded because she, the gospel was everything. Even though they murdered her husband, she didn't take vengeance. She actually had an incredibly compassionate heart. She wanted the gospel to be preached. And so she went forward, and she actually ended up living with her child with this Ecuadorian tribe for several years. That was one of many incredible things that she did. So she's rightfully lauded and celebrated as one of our heroes. The servant to the poor, Mother Teresa and Heidi Baker. Mother Teresa is obviously was a founder of one of the Catholic orders. She served for decades in the slums of Delhi. Some of you may know Heidi Baker. She's sort of a modern day Mother Teresa. She was actually incredibly inspired by Mother Teresa. She went to Mozambique about 25 years ago. Basically didn't speak Portuguese, which is a native tongue, but was able to land there and has spent the last 25 years. She's planted, I think, on the order of 7,000 churches, has cared for tens of thousands of orphans. So we concluded our last conversation was on spiritual formation through serving the poor, while these two are pretty much the paragons of what it means to serve the poor. Number 3, the evangelist, Billy Graham. Billy Graham died, I think, about a year ago now at the age of 99. I grew up in a Christian home, but I do remember going to his very last crusade. Was anyone there in 2005? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are others. Okay, this is cool. This was 14 years ago. It was his last crusade. I don't know if you guys remember. I think over the course of several days, like nearly 100,000 people showed up. It stated that Billy Graham actually directly preached on the order of 1 billion people. And I don't know where they get the stat from, but it's in Wikipedia and the internet, so it must be true. 3.2 million people said yes to following God at Billy Graham crusades. He very well might be, at least in some sense of the term, the most fruitful evangelist.
Yeah.
And I remember at that crusade, Billy Graham was what? He was probably like in his mid-80s at that time. I don't know that he was the most gifted orator, but he just had this amazing grace upon him. And so midway through his talk, he just asked everyone, 30,000 people that day, he's like, "Are you lost?" That's all he said. And we all were just like, "Yes, we're lost." It was almost like when he asked you if you were lost, you were like, "Yes, I'm lost." And it's like you just wanted to come to the altar and run into the loving arms of Jesus. And so the evangelist Billy Graham, absolutely a deserving hero in our subculture. And then the last one is the preacher, Tim Keller, a little closer to home. Tim is arguably, he's undoubtedly the finest expositor of God's word, I believe, in the last 25, 30 years. I remember when I first came to New York, Tim was just a preacher at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And so a couple thousand people that attended Redeemer knew who Tim Keller was. This guy was made for the podcast era.
Yeah.
Basically, podcasting took him worldwide. I meet people all over the globe who are like, man, my life was changed because one night I was listening to a sermon by this guy. And anybody who's listened to Tim, and the amazing thing about him is he preaches basically 1 or 2 sermons, but he has this amazing ability to make you think he's saying something new. But he's actually not. What he's just doing is he's repeating the same basic tenets of God's grace and God's love, but he does it in such profound ways. So here are the heroes. Here are the people that we look up to in the Christian faith. So what do they all have in common? Well, they all basically work for the church or some faith-based organization, right? And again, I have nothing, we obviously need these folks who are going to work for the church, work for these faith-based organizations like these fine people on this board. But it begs the question, where does that leave the rest of us? Where does that leave the 99.9%, some very large percentage of us who basically don't work for the church? We don't work at a faith-based organization. Well, the first answer I got to that question was the first retreat I ever attended. I was finishing up my PhD, my graduate program. I go on this retreat, and I don't even remember the guy's name, but at the first evening plenary, he gets up there and says, "Okay, I feel like the Lord is telling me that there's a bunch of people in this room who are called to go into full-time ministry, called to be pastors and missionaries. And then there's others of you in this room who are called into business. And you guys called into business, your job is to make as much money as you can so you can support the first group. That's not funny. I mean, I wasn't trying to, I'm not trying to besmirch what he said because it's actually true. There's a sense in which that's actually true. My wife and I don't know if he was speaking directly to me, but that's what I've done. I've gone into business. We've done all right, and we've sowed, we've sowed probably the majority of our resources that we've been blessed with over the years to doing exactly that, supporting people, right? But I think the problem, in some sense, is that what the speaker was saying, it just sort of inadvertently reinforces this sacred secular divide. It suggests that there are these people who are doing the work that we're supposed to do, and the rest of us are here to sort of support that. I mean, even the way he phrased it, some of you are called into full-time ministry. I mean, called. That just sounds so noble. When you're called, it's like, gosh, you must have just like heard something from God. Full-time ministry. What does that term even mean? What are the rest of us? Part-time ministers? No-time ministers? So it's somehow, it's not, again, there's nothing intentional about this, but I really think that the sacred secular divide is so woven into our language, into our everyday institutions, even our tax code. The sacred secular divide is woven into our tax code. If I have lunch with one of you guys and I put my Pastor John Kim hat on, I can write that off. Because there's this whole part of the tax code that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with called 501c3 that is tax exempt. But if I just go have dinner as a friend, just to hang out, catch a ball game or something, well, that's not tax deductible. Apparently there's a whole class of things that the government has decided, you know what, these things are tax exempt, everything else isn't. So these things, our structures reinforce this idea of a sacred secular divide. What message does this ultimately send to those of us who are in the regular workplace, which is pretty much everyone here? The first message you get is be ethical at work. Do the right thing. Back when I was first getting to the investment business, we had this phrase, don't do anything that's going to land you on the cover of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. I have a couple friends who actually sadly have done things that have landed them on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Super embarrassing. You don't want to embarrass the faith. You don't want to embarrass the church, embarrass your family. Be ethical at work. That's job number one. Second, go to work and then invite your colleagues to church. It's innocent enough. You know, invite your friends, invite your work friends to church. Because they can come to church, they can hear a message, they can see what God is doing, they can somehow get acclimated into Christian culture. Again, I'm not against being ethical at work. I'm not against inviting your colleagues to church. And then finally, we're told, help build the church. Help build this institution. Invest your time and resources into this. It's like that guy said, you know, if you make money, spend whatever you need on yourself, but make it small and then try to give the rest away. Really do what you can to practice this radical generosity. And radical generosity is almost always articulated as giving to 501c3s. So I think it's fair to say that I think this idea is largely rubbish. Anyone who's been in this community for any period of time, what they know is that we have implicitly been attempting to destroy the sacred secular divide. The Vineyard is actually, as a movement, is attempting to do that. What is our favorite value, Steve McNeely?
Everybody gets to play.
Everybody gets to play, exactly. I've been saying that every week for about 2 years, and Steve just got it.
I just go to the national conference.
Exactly. But the reason why we hold that in such high esteem is because we really do believe there's no sacred secular divide. These prophetic worship and prophecy nights that we do is because we don't think that just one or two you guys are gifted prophetically. We actually sincerely believe that all of you are designed to equally desire the gift of prophecy and to practice these things, right? And so today I'm going to be a little more explicit. So we've been doing this implicitly ever since our founding. The fact that we have no full-time staff is another implicit way in which we're saying there's no sacred secular divide. Any of us, no matter what we do, can actually do the stuff that Jesus did, right? I like, well, where are we going? I don't know how that got there. This is a great quote. by a fellow by the name of Abraham Kuyper, who was not only a theologian, but I found out recently he was a prime minister of the Netherlands between around the early 1900s. So there is no square inch of territory in the whole universe over which Christ does not say, "This is mine." There's a bunch of T-shirts that I saw. Not a single square inch, right? Sort of the abbreviated sense in which everything belongs under the authority of Jesus. Everything is made sacred with the proper lens. And so the clues as to how we should be thinking about work, I think, are found, as I mentioned earlier, in the creation account. The creation account is really long, so I have a slightly abridged version of it here, which will get the point. I'm going to do something creative here. No, I'm not going to do anything creative. I'm actually going to just ask one person to read. It's on 2 slides. I'm going to ask Ruth to read the first 4, and I'm going to ask Efren to read the next 4, if you can.
Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the waters under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let the dry ground appear," and it was so. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds," and it was so. And God saw that it was good.
Sorry, just continue, Efren.
Okay. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times, and days and years. And let the lights be in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." God saw all that he had made, and it was very good.
Thank you. Even though I eliminated large swaths of the text, I think you get the idea. The creation account can be summarized very simply as, in the beginning, God worked. God is a worker. He spent 6 days working and creating this marvelous thing that we call earth. It says in chapter 2 at the very beginning, and then he just rested. Right? So from the beginning, God is a worker. He's a very good worker. He's very creative, obviously, but he breathed things into life because that's what God does. The 2 people who are widely considered to have been the best at this Christianity thing to ever walk the earth are Jesus and Paul. Jesus also worked. In fact, we all know that Jesus spent the first 30 years of his life not in public ministry, but, well, I think he was a stonemason. People think he was a carpenter. I read a commentary just the other day that suggested, no, he was probably more like a stonemason. I like that image better. I like the image of a construction worker lifting heavy things as my Jesus a little bit better. Not to say that carpenters don't, but the image of Jesus as a worker, 30 years prior to public ministry. And I don't think that was something that was just incidental. I don't think it was accidental. It was, I think, very deliberate. And similarly with Paul. Paul, as many of you know, Paul was what they call a tent maker. Well, actually, he was a literal tent maker, but the term, because of Paul, actually means somebody who actually supports themselves. But Paul made tents in the Roman Empire, and that's what he did. And he talked about how he didn't want to actually, so sometimes he was supported, but other times he wasn't. So again, Paul wasn't, my point here isn't that there's nothing wrong with others supporting people who are full-time mission. But my point here is that Paul thought it was important actually to support himself and to work, okay? I think the idea of God as a worker, God as a creator, is probably, that resonates with most of us. It's the second part, it's this latter half where God creates man and then he tells us what to do that I think is really interesting and what I want us to focus on. He basically says, we're basically told that God, we are made in God's image, right? So he tells us to be fruitful, increase in number, to fill the earth, and then he tells us to subdue it. Subdue is a very interesting verb. It means actually to bring something under your control, to bring something under your dominion, right? And what's interesting is that this is before the fall. So even though what God made something amazing. But even then, even before the fall, it was necessary for us to actually exercise dominion, exercise authority that God granted us to basically take care of this thing that he created, this world. And to what end? To what end did God call us to do this? Well, we've been saying throughout this series on spiritual formation that we do this, we're formed into the image of Jesus for the sake of others. So there's something about us as image bearers of God being granted his authority. I mean, he told us to rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves on the ground. It's great being on the top of the food chain, isn't it? I mean, we eat everything else. That's awesome. But the point is that God actually gave us dominion, gave us authority, told us to take care of this thing that he created. And I submit to you that the reason why he did so is that when we exercise this and do so for the sake of others, we are actually, we are finding our lane that God has created all of us for. How many of you guys see your regular work life in this light? I think it's, well, that's great. I want to further reinforce that. I think it's easy to see how we're partnering with God and we're receiving his authority and exercising dominion over brokenness in the world when we pray for someone. It's easy to see that when we are helping the restoration of a broken marriage, or if we're praying for someone to be freed from an addiction. Those seem like holy and sacred things. But do we see our work that way? Our mundane work? We can, and I think we should. I have a couple examples here at the 166, his actual community. Vivian Lowe, who many of you know, she's the operations manager at Coram Deo. I prefer to call her the chief subduer of chaos. If you've ever owned a building, New York City is a tough place to own a building. The weather, for starters, I mean, it's a very, we have all, this isn't Southern California where it's 60 to 80 degrees every single day. There's never any rain, and so the elements are never really affecting the physical structure. A place like New York, in a building like this, we are subject to the forces of entropy. Vivian's job, among other things, is to basically manage the chaos that would occur if she wasn't there. We know it's chaotic because actually Karen and I tried to do it before we hired her, and it was a disaster. There are hundreds of people that come through this place. There are 3 different organizations that operate out of here. People are bumping into each other. But we've given Vivian dominion over Coram Deo. And when she exercises that well, things run smoothly. The reason why this place is so beautiful, and you've all enjoyed it, everything from down here to the first floor to the roof deck, any of the rooms in between to the courtyard, is because Vivian is conscientiously making sure that this is a place where other people can flourish. So, operations manager of Coram Deo, sure, but in reality, I call her the chief subduer of the chaos which would otherwise ensue. And she does so others can flourish as they come through this building. Number 2, Rosanna and David Bucks. Many of you guys maybe know them as, they run a music school called Keys to Success. They basically teach piano, guitar, voice lessons, right? In my view, they are tending to a garden. They are tending to an ecosystem of students, parents, teachers. This environment which they've created. I mean, I remember I was there when they had 18 students. They now have over 200 students, and I think they have 14 or 15 teachers. But I'm a first-hand witness to, by starting this enterprise, they have dominion. They actually have some authority in the lives of all the teachers, and the families that they're involved in. It's actually a very interesting role, as I was saying earlier. Teachers have just extraordinary influence. I've seen it in my son Samuel. I remember the first time he was, I've shared the story, his first recital, he was so nervous. He was like freaking out. He was like screaming how he didn't want to do it. It was like the one time like we actually had to somehow like settle him down. But then he actually did it. He overcame his fear. And now when he does recitals, he's actually happily doing so. And the important thing there is he's learning a life skill, you know, because he's gonna encounter these kinds of things again. But what KTS does is they put things into their students in a way that allows these students to just be better at life. And on top of that, what I've noticed, and I think David and Roseanne have shared here, is that they're now in the lives of these students, of these parents, and their teachers. They're woven into the fabric of these people. And because if they exercise their dominion well, basically it will lead to the flourishing of anyone who's connected with the enterprise. Last one, the only one who's here, Erin Keel, dermatologist. She's a physician who's bringing order to people's skin. I mean, in all seriousness, like when your skin goes haywire, it can be tough. And I think actually she's probably restoring a lot of people's self-esteem along the way as well. Don't freak out, Erin, but I actually Googled you. Because I just wanted to see what other people had to say about her. I'm gonna just read this one thing that I read on a review site. It said, I think it was a woman, said that Dr. Erin Keel was attentive, empathetic, patient, and funny. She answered all my questions, even though I had many. She explained not only the symptoms on my skin, but also the reasons behind why she prescribed each medication. I was thoroughly impressed with her impeccable bedside manners and her passion for educating her patients about how to better care for their skin. The prescriptions I received were delivered to my pharmacy the same day and immediately did wonders on my skin. I had many friends point out that my skin improved in just a month with my new medications. And I read stuff like that and I'm like, oh, like Erin's work is not some necessary evil. It's not something that she does to pass a day. It's not even a means to an end. It's not even a means to which, you know, she can support people who are doing the real kingdom work of God. It actually is the arena in which she's partaking in what God is doing. And I think that's what we have with all of these guys, is that if we can see our work life as somehow partaking in what God is doing to restore things to the way they're supposed to be, that gives a lens and that gives meaning to our work that doesn't make it less than. It doesn't make it something that, you know, we do these 40, 50, 60, sometimes 80 hours a week. But it actually, that's where we're actually being formed. It's the arena in which we're formed as we're partnering, co-creating with God. Now, of course, not everyone feels this, and all of us here don't feel that way all the time because of the fall, right? Genesis 3:17, cursed is the ground because of you. With painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. We're all subject to the effects of the fall. And I understand that there are probably some people in here who maybe don't fully enjoy what they do, or maybe there are some people who are in between jobs and looking for something that they really want to do. What I'm trying to say is not right now that wherever you are right now, you have to feel this way about it. What I'm trying to say is that there's a manner in which, the way in which God has created us, there's a place somewhere in the marketplace where we can exercise these gifts, partner with God, and act out our dominion over whatever sphere He's given to us. There's this phrase that I use a lot with the people who work with me. I say, it's really important that you take pride in your work. Christians are allergic to that phrase because the word pride is in there, right? And we know that, gosh, pride is like the worst thing we could have. Pride cometh before the fall. That's actually a misnomer. Because it's interesting, when I say you should take pride in your work, what I mean is that you should do your work as if you should have like a craftsman's attention to what you're doing. Because even if nobody else sees it, the important thing is that you see it. And in some sense, it's sort of like saying, you know what? God sees it. God sees what I'm doing. And so it's not just about, how it's valued in the marketplace. It's not just about how it's valued by my colleagues or who sees what I do. There's something intrinsically good in what I'm doing, and I take pride in what I'm doing, and I'm gonna put my best into it. And in some sense, that's one of my hopes for this community. If we can be people in the workplace who are sort of a signpost. I mean, in some sense, that's sometimes one of the best things we can do is just give people who don't know God just some sort of indication of what the kingdom of God looks like. And if we go about our work that way, that's what we can be. We can be a signpost for how things can be. Okay, real quickly, the two practical suggestions I have. The first is partnering with God in the workplace to be the divinely inspired worker. Brad, do you mind reading that?
My eyesight.
Oh, your eyesight's not that good, sorry. Stella, can you read that? What is it? We need an eye doctor at the 166, obviously. Erin, can you read that?
Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Ur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled with him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of crafts.
Bezalel, this is basically right around the time that they were building the tabernacle, where the presence of the Lord would reside. Bezalel is the first of a long line of people who were divinely inspired by God in their work. This is beautiful. The Spirit of the Lord falls on him, so he can basically make something really beautiful, right? Obviously, later on in the New Testament, we hear about people like Joseph, who was had divine wisdom to allocate resources, and then of course Daniel, who served under Nebuchadnezzar under Babylonian exile. So there's actually a history of the people of God being divinely inspired by God. There's an interesting sense in which, the more I thought about this, how cool would it be to basically invite God and have access to the mind of God in our regular work life? We don't do prosperity gospel here, but man, that is an incredible competitive edge vis-a-vis the other people in the workplace, to have access to the mind of Christ. Some of you guys know this, but early in my faith journey, I was having a heck of a time, an incredibly difficult time in my PhD program at MIT. And it was the first time in my life that I actually struggled in an academic setting. I mean, it was really tough. My entire identity was built on academic excellence, and I walk into this institution where I literally feel like I have no idea what I'm doing. And about 6 weeks into the program, I just prayed to God one day at the MIT Student Center. I said, and I barely knew Jesus at the time, and I just said, God, do something with my brain. I don't understand my notes. I can't do the problem sets, and I almost failed my first exam. If you don't do something, I'm not going to make it here. Well, after that prayer, all of a sudden, literally everything made sense. I became someone who needed help to actually was helping the other 20 students in my class. And so I've continued to go back to this this construct of what it looks like for people to invite God. And it doesn't have to be like, hey, help me understand, the folk theorem, or nonlinear econometrics or any of the stuff that I was doing. It could be even simple things. It could be inviting God into the basics of decision making. But all of us work in spheres or environments where we can use God's help. And I think if we access, I mean, Paul writes that we actually have access to the mind of Christ. Jesus told us we will do even greater things than what he's doing. If we choose to access that, there's something extraordinary that I believe can happen in our workplace. The second thing, partnering with God in the workplace, is the modern urban witness. Anyone have eyes to read that? Steve.
Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us.
This is a great verse, and it's so apropos for our times. I don't know if you guys are aware, but the term evangelical Christian is a bit of a tough designation these days. We haven't had a great marketing plan in the last 20 years. Ever since I started following God, there's almost been this like continuous decline. And in places like New York in particular, it's almost like to the point where, you know, it's there's almost like a hostility. I hear coworkers, I hear friends of mine in other fields talk all the time about how, you know, you can't even verbalize being a Christian because you'll automatically be discriminated against, or, you know, what have you. So trying to go into the workplace and starting to, you know, drop truth bombs and Bible verses on people is probably not the most effective way to witness to the way of Jesus. But what you can do, what is encouraged here in 1 Peter 2:12 is live such good lives that even though they accuse you of doing wrong, even though they want to say, you know, you're one of those judgmental Christians, they see your good deeds and glorify God on that day. Now, if you've been with us any length of time, you know that you can't generate good deeds on your own. We're not able to be good on our own, but what we can do is somehow submit ourselves to the way of Jesus, and as we're formed into the image of Jesus, that those good deeds are a byproduct. And this is why we talk so much here about things like a rule of life. Rule of life is nothing more than a way to organize your day where you just follow what Jesus said, where he says, seek first the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Incredible things happen when we begin our days. I suspect everyone here can tell the noticeable difference when they begin their day in God's word, when they begin their day in prayer. A rule of life encourages us to do that because those 15, 20, 30 minutes that we spend cultivating these quiet liminal spaces with God, that's what transforms us. That's what makes us into people who live such good lives. It's not going to happen because we're trying. It's not going to happen just because we have really good rhetoric or we have really good skills or what have you. We actually have to become attractive people. And the only way that I know to do that is to continuously submit our time and our lives to the way of Jesus. And a rule of life is one of the best ways we know to get there. Actually, before I get to that, yeah, just to sum up on the pragmatic suggestions, I just, again, had this picture of us as a community of people who are so connected with God that we can hear his voice as when we bring the problems that we have in the workplace to him. And I also see us as a group of people who are continuously being transformed. And so when people look at us, it's kind of like what Ruth said earlier, it's like, oh my gosh, you guys are different. You know, you guys aren't like other people. That can only happen, again, when we're being transformed, which is why these spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices are so central to the things we talk about here in 166. I'm going to end this with, and I'll read it, with a word from Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard, as many of you know, just a brilliant theologian and philosopher. So he wrote in Divine Conspiracy, if Jesus were to come today, as he did then, he could carry out his mission through most any decent and useful occupation. He could be a clerk or accountant in a hardware store, a computer repairman, a banker, an editor, doctor, waiter, teacher, farmhand, lab technician, or construction worker. He could run a house cleaning service or repair autos. In other words, if Jesus were to come today, he could very well do what you do. He could very well live in your apartment or house, hold down your job, have your education and life prospects, live within your family surrounding and time. None of this would be the least hindrance to the eternal kind of life that was his by nature and becomes available to us through him. Our work lives are not a hindrance to the eternal kind of life that is available to us through him. So, let me close this.